What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video, and today we're going to be going over the Stamina Sorcerer DPS. So, I've mentioned this a couple of times already in prior build videos, but not much has changed for DPS in terms of kind of rotations and skills between Dragonhold and Harrowstorm. Yes, there were a few balance changes, very emphasis on the few, but none of them really touched that many DPS. The only one that really got touched was Mag Decay because of the buff to Elfbane, but pretty much all the other DPS specs have pretty much remained more or less where they were. Harrowstorm was not really advertised as a big balance patch, so a lot of the DPS builds you're going to be seeing are going to be very similar to the ones that were out for the Dragonhold patch. So like the rest of our build videos, this one will not be going over any sort of gear. Gear is covered in a separate gear video, which will be popping up in the upper right hand corner right about now. So if you're interested in knowing what gear I'm running, check out that video and then come back here. This video is going to be going over just our skills and our rotation. So let's go ahead and get started here first with skills. Now I will point out here that I will also show you guys a two-handed setup because Stamsorcs can make use of two-handed builds as well, just because they don't have a class execute, so they can make use of two-handed builds, but I personally prefer dual-wield builds, and I'll talk about why that is in a little bit. So for the dual-wield build, for our front bar, which is the dual-wield bar, we have Rapid Strikes as our spammable, Whirling Blades for execute. We're going to be using this once we hit around 30% to 25% health remaining. Then we have Hurricane, Barbed Trap, Bound Armaments, and Flawless Dawnbreaker. Flawless Dawnbreaker is pretty decent as an ultimate to use, but primarily you're going to be using our backbar ultimate, which is Greater Storm Atronach. For our backbar, we have Consuming Soul Trap, Poison Injection, Endless Hail because we are using the Maelstrom bow. You can also use Arrow Barrage if you're running the Master's Bow, but Endless Hail is the DPS difference between the two of them is going to be fairly small overall. We do have Dark Deal here as additional sustain tool. If you're running a two-handed build, sustain might actually be okay. You might not need Dark Deal, but for a dual-wield build, it might be beneficial to have Dark Deal here. It's going to be dependent on your group support. So on a trial dummy, you probably will need to use Dark Deal at least a few times in order to sustain the full parse. But in an actual raid, you will have more sources of sustain, so you might not need to run Dark Deal. If you're kind of fit into that area there where you don't need Dark Deal in an actual raid, you can replace this with a Fighter's Shield ability to get the additional weapon damage. And then we have Bound Armaments again and Greater Storm Atronach. Now for a two-handed build, you will, instead of running Rapid Strikes, you'll be running Wrecking Blow instead. And then instead of Whirling Blades to execute, you're going to be using either Reverse Slice or Executioner. It's kind of up to you which one you prefer. Reverse Slice will give you some cleave. Executioner will give you more single target damage. Most people will end up using Executioner. And then for two-handed builds, you could also run Brawler or Carve. Most people will go with Brawler for the damage shield in trash fights. So a lot of Stamina DPS will actually use two-handed builds for a trash fight because Brawler is a pretty decent spammable that cleaves things, and then swap over to dual-wield builds for single target DPS. So that is one option there for you to run. So we talked about, so Dark Deal is a flex spot, so I already mentioned you can run a Fighter Skill ability for more weapon damage, but if you prefer to run something like a self-heal, you can certainly use something like Vigor instead. Echoing Vigor is going to be my recommendation over Resolving Vigor, because Echoing Vigor can stack with other people's Echoing Vigors. So if you have 2 or 3 Echoing Vigors going out, your healing done per second is actually going to be about the same or greater than Resolving Vigor. So it's always more beneficial to have Echoing Vigor because it also heals other people as well, so it's a little bit of additional group support as well. Dark Deal by itself does also have a heal, but it's a burst heal rather than a heal over time like Vigor, so you could still use Dark Deal as a self-heal, but there is a cast time associated with it. There's a 1-second cast time, so you might need to be very aware of the fight, what's going on, so that way you're not caught casting when you should be blocking instead. So just be mindful of that if you want to use Dark Deal as a self-heal. It's certainly possible to do so, plus you get a sustain bonus, but because of that cast time, you do have to be a little bit mindful of when you do end up using it. So that pretty much covers it for skills. Now let's go ahead and talk about rotation, and I'll show you guys both the two-handed rotation and then the dual-wield rotation. The DPS between the two is going to be very similar. You can actually hit a little bit higher with a two-handed build on a trial dummy. I do not have a parse saved up, so you're just going to have to take my word for it. But in an actual trial scenario, I'll talk about this in a little bit. You're going to want to go dual in an actual single target trial scenario unless your goal is to have some additional cleave damage. The rotation's fairly straightforward. If you guys are familiar with Nightblade rotations, you kind of have the same thing going on here with Bound Armaments. So after 4 light attacks, you're going to want to use Bound Armaments to get the additional damage out from Bound Armaments. But other than that, it's pretty much maintaining your dots and then just using your spamble in between. Now, Hurricane lasts for 15 seconds and Barb Trap lasts for 18. Everything else on the back bar lines up pretty decently well. 14 for Endless Hail, 10 for Poison Injection, and 10 for Consuming Trap. So Endless Hail is going to be lasting a little bit longer, which isn't that big of a deal. Unless you're using the Master's Bow, having a little bit of downtime on Poison Injection and Consuming Trap isn't the worst thing in the world. So you can pretty much line these 3 dots up. So it's really just try keeping an eye on Hurricane and Barbed Trap. So rotation's fairly straightforward. I always like to have Dark Deal active first, so that way I have a little bit of stam sustain going into the parse. Or into the fight, I should say. And then you can see here, once I hit 4 light attacks, you use Bound Armaments. Make sure to use it right away, so that way you're not sitting on it. And then if you need a sustain, then use Dark Deal again when it runs out. But if you don't need it, then don't run it. There is a cast time associated with it, so it doesn't mean you're going to end up using less spambles the more you cast Dark Deal. So it's kind of that trade-off there. Now, I will want to point out the proper way of using Bound Armaments, and it's very similar to Nightblades. So you can see here we have a counter. So now we have 3 stacks, and unlike the bow proc for Nightblades, you can just use it right off the bat. As soon as you have 1 or more daggers, you can just use it right away. But obviously you're going to want to wait until you have 4 daggers. Now, I mentioned you do 4 light attacks and then your Bound Armaments, so in isolation this is what it should look like. 1 light attack, 2 light attacks, 3 light attacks, and then you do light attack Bound Armaments. What I see some people do, and I'm going to be using Rapid Strikes here as just kind of like a placeholder for any abilities. What I see some people do is they do something like this. I'm not sure if you guys can tell the difference there, but basically what it is you have 1 light attack ability, 2 light attacks abilities, 3 light attack ability, and then you should be doing 4 light attack Bound Armaments. What I see some people do is they do light attack ability, light attack ability, light attack ability, light attack ability, and then light attack Bound Armaments. Take that into consideration, one of your light attacks is not counting for the next Bound Armaments proc. Basically you have 5 light attacks, but you only get 4 daggers. You can't stack additional daggers on top of the 4 that you already get. So with that regard, you do want to do light attack ability, light attack ability, light attack ability, light attack Bound Armaments. So make sure after you do that 4th light attack, you use Bound Armaments right away. Now you can activate it on the back bar if you'd like. It is going to be weaker, so you can see here 3789 compared to 4338. So I personally, if I get 4 stacks on the back bar, I don't use them on the back bar. I wait until I'm on my front bar because then I get more damage out of it. It is kind of up to you whether you want to do that or not. It's also dependent on whether you have Bound Armaments active on both bars, because you can swap Bound Armaments out on the back bar for something like Vigor or any other sort of mitigation ability like Evasion, for example. So try to activate Bound Armaments on your front bar because it does end up doing more damage. But the general rule of thumb is don't use 4 light attacks, 4 abilities, and then use a 5th light attack, and then use Bound Armaments. You're basically wasting a proc of Bound Armaments that way. The best way to kind of demonstrate that is actually through a rotation, so I'll show you guys what the rotation... Oh, before we do our 20mm parse, the... reset the dummy here. Two-handed build here. So a two-handed build, we have Wrecking Blow, and I reverse slice, but it should be Executioner, but it's not a big deal. Then we are running, let me just pull it up, we are running Lokkestiiz Battle Axe for additional bleed damage. Now you can do Sharpened or Precise. I have Precise here, I don't think I haven't transmuted this yet. Rotation with a two-handed build is pretty much exactly the same. So start off with Dark Deal, make sure you have Bound Armaments active, lay down your trap, Everything else is exactly the same. Difference is you're using Wrecking Blow rather than Rapid Strikes. So it's basically the exact same concept here, except instead of Rapid Strikes, you have Wrecking Blow. Not that much difference. Now, before we do the 20 million dummy parse, I will point out the difference between Wrecking Blow and Rapid Strikes. They might seem similar, but there are subtle differences here. There's small nuances here. Wrecking Blow has a cast time. As you can see here, cast time 0.8 seconds. Rapid Strikes has a channel time 0.6 seconds. These are two different things, even though they look like they operate identically. A cast time basically means that you will not deal the damage until the cast time is complete. So, one thing that can happen with Wrecking Blow is if you get out of range, sometimes, before the cast time will finish, so let's say we're going as far as we possibly can. You can see here that if the boss happens to move out of range while you're charging up, you actually won't get it off. You won't get the Wrecking Blow off. Now if we compare that to something like Rapid Strikes instead, just put on the dual wield. Oh, that should be on the offhand. So we have about the same range here. And we kind of have the same thing going on here, where if it moves out of range, the channel won't complete. But at the very least, we're still doing some damage when we're doing it, compared to Wrecking Blow, where we actually won't deal any damage at all. So, kind of two very different things here. So, with the dual wield, at the very least, you're getting some damage off, but with the two-hand, you're not getting any damage off. So that's the difference between cast and channeled. So because of that, dual wield is going to be just a little bit stronger in those situations in raids where you might have bosses that are moving around a little bit. But that pretty much covers two-handed versus dual wield. Realistically, you can use either of them for static bosses like the dragons in Sunspire, for example. They pretty much just sit there and let you hit them. So in that instance, two-handed might be a little bit better, but you still want to take into consideration the fact that there's a cast versus a channel between two-handed and dual wield. But enough about that. Let's go ahead and do our 21 million dummy parse here. As a reminder, the 21 million dummy parse is not necessarily indicative of in-raid performance. That's because the 21 million dummy is missing a couple of debuffs and buffs that you would be getting in an actual raid environment. So we're missing things like Martial Knowledge, Zens, we're missing sustain tools like Symphony of Blades, Massive Restoration Staff, and so on. So it's not necessarily indicative of what you would actually be pulling in raids. We will try to simulate a little bit of the sustain bonuses by using Lavafoot, Parse Food, but that's not really identical to the sustain you will see in an actual raid environment. Just bear that in mind. The 21 million dummy parse should only be used as a point of comparison across different class DPSs on the same dummy. So don't use this as sort of, this is what you should be hitting in raid. This is more of a, this is how classes stack up against each other. So let's go ahead and get started. Now I am using Maarselok, which makes it a little bit tricky to bash because of that channel time with Rapid Strikes. But you do want to try to bash on cooldown if you can. If you have an add-on that adds in the cast or channel bar, I found that if you use it right when the channel bar empties, like that, you can get the bash off with very limited sort of delay, but it does take a little bit of practice to do so. And also don't forget you can bash on your bow bar as well and still get the Maarselok proc. You can also just use it whenever you use Hurricane or Rearming Trap. Make sure you're letting Hurricane run completely out because the biggest hits do happen towards the end of Hurricane. So make sure you're just running completely out before you recast Hurricane. We'll recast Trap here just so it doesn't run out while we're on a back bar. So once we hit about 30% health or so, we're going to be swapping over to Whirling Blades instead. So around here, doing Whirling Blades. And this is where you will see a little bit of a deep sustain drop here, because Whirling Blades is harder to sustain than Rapid Strikes. For two-handed build, this is where you would be using Executioner instead. Then in Execute, it's up to you whether you want to keep up down Armaments or not. Some people don't like keeping it up, other people do. It's kind of up to you how you want to do that. There you go, that is a two-handed build. I did mention beginning of this video that two-handed builds will pull a little bit higher DPS. We're talking maybe like 1k or 2k higher. I don't have a parse, so you're just gonna have to take my word for it. So I pulled 83.2k with a dual wield build, so a two-handed build with about the same RNG in terms of crit chances and things like that. We'd probably be sitting somewhere around 84k or so, maybe upwards of like 84.5k. Again, not a big difference between two-handed and dual wield. On a dummy, yes, a two-handed build is going to be higher than a dual wield build, but in an actual raid environment, dual wield is going to be a little bit stronger compared to two-handed. But yeah, that's pretty much where Stamsorks sit. Pretty decent. They do have very good survivability, with Hurricane providing major resolve, and just having Dark Deal for sustain is also really nice to have. Generally speaking, Stamsorks don't really offer much to the table, so you won't really see them being used very often in sort of very high-end endgame PvE, but clearly they can pull enough DPS to pretty much cover anything in the game there. But that concludes this build video. Hopefully you guys found it informative. If you guys have any questions at all, feel free to leave them in the comment section below. I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.